On November 1st, 1950, 6 swept-wing fighters in unmarked silver paint dropped out of the haze over the Yalu River and tore through a flight of American P-51 Mustangs that had been operating without competition for 5 months. The Mustangs survived. The illusion did not. Within seconds, every piston-engined assumption the United Nations Command had been operating under in Korea was finished. The aircraft were MiG-15s. They were faster than anything the Americans had in the theater. They climbed harder. They turned at altitudes the F-80 Shooting Star could not even reach. They had cannons large enough to disassemble a B-29. And they were being flown by Russians. Not Korean pilots, not Chinese volunteers, Russians. Drawn from the elite air defense regiments that had spent the previous 5 years guarding Moscow itself, men who had killed Messerschmitts over Stalingrad and Berlin, now wearing Chinese uniforms and carrying forged identity papers, forbidden by direct order of Joseph Stalin to speak Russian on the radio. The pretense fooled no one. By the summer of 1952, American signals intelligence had concluded that more than 90% of the MiGs flying over MiG Alley were piloted by Soviet personnel. The geographical importance, though, is that MiG Alley is the northwest corridor of Korea, where the air battles concentrated just below the Chinese border. The United States Air Force had a problem. It was solved on paper by an aircraft. The North American F-86 Sabre, the only Western fighter with swept wings then in production, was rushed to Korea. The 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing arrived in December 1950 and operated forward from Kimpo. The 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing converted from F-80S to F-86 SS late in 1951 under Colonel Francis Kabreski, the World War II ace with 28 European victories. The first Sabre kill against a MiG came on December 17, 1950, when Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Hinton of the 336th Fighter Squadron downed a Soviet major named Yefremenko. For the next 2.5 years, between the Chongchon and the Yalu, 2 of the most important fighters of the early Cold War flew at each other almost daily. The Air Force came home from Korea claiming a kill ratio of 10-1. 792 MiG-15s destroyed. 78 Sabres lost. That number was wrong. It was wrong by a margin large enough that the Air Force itself, in a quiet post-war reassessment called Sabre Measure Charlie, halved the figure to roughly 5-1. Subsequent scholarship has pushed it closer to 2-1 overall, with stretches of the war during which Soviet-flown MiGs achieved actual parity, and in some months, actually inflicted heavier losses on the Sabre force than they took. What is more interesting than the corrected number is what produced it. The 2 aircraft were near equals. The MiG-15 Beatyaz weighed roughly 8,115 pounds, empty against the Sabre's 10,950. The MiG had a higher service ceiling, climbed faster at all altitudes until the F-86F finally caught up late in the war and accelerated harder above 30,000 feet. Its turn radius was tighter at very high altitude, and its armament was on a different scale entirely. 1 37mm cannon and 2 23mm cannons, designed from inception not to dogfight other fighters, but to disassemble American strategic bombers. A 2-second burst could put 14 kilograms of explosive shell into a B-29. Soviet pilots called the F-86's .650 caliber Brownings pea shooters. The insult was not unfair. American pilots routinely reported emptying their entire ammunition load into a MiG that simply flew home. Where the Sabre held the edge was in places that mattered, but in subtler ways than altitude or firepower. It was faster on the deck. It dove harder. Its hydraulic-boosted controls and the all-flying tailplane introduced on the F-86E meant Sabre pilots could push their aircraft right up against the speed of sound and stay in command of it, while the MiG-15 became dangerously stiff above Mach 0.92, prone to tucking, spinning, and refusing to recover. The MiG simply could not be flown the way the Sabre could be flown at the upper edge of the envelope. The Sabre had a bubble canopy. The MiG had a smaller framed canopy that fogged. In a war where 80 to 90% of pilots shot down never saw their attacker, that single difference in glass meant the Sabre pilot lived in a world the MiG pilot could not see. The Sabre had a G-suit. The MiG did not. The Sabre had hydraulic controls that did not fatigue the pilot's arms after a hard turn. The MiG had cable controls that left a man wrung out after 30 minutes. And the Sabre had something the MiG did not have at all: a radar. The AN/APG-30 was a small X-band ranging set mounted in the upper lip of the Sabre's nose. It fed a continuous range solution to the A1CM lead computing gun sight. The pilot put the pip on the target, the analog computer factored in range, target motion, and his own maneuver, and the gun fired at the calculated firing solution. It was effective out to 3,000 feet. The MiG-15's gun sight was a 1939-era optical mechanism that required the pilot to estimate target wingspan and range manually before pulling the trigger. When the Soviets recovered Captain Bill Garrett's downed F-86A in October of 1951, an engineer named Vadim Matskevich wrote a classified report concluding that the Sabre's gun sight was a generation ahead of anything the Soviet Union had in the air. Stalin's USSR being what it was, his colleagues filed 30 denunciations against him. Walker Mahurin, the Sabre pilot who flew the F-86E in Korea, called the radar gun sight the single greatest improvement to the airplane during the entire war. So the Sabre had real advantages. It was a more refined machine in 1,000 small ways. But none of this explains the kill ratio. Because here is the thing that sits underneath all of it, and that no amount of bubble canopy and radar gun sight can paper over. When the Sabres met the best Soviet pilots, they did not win. They drew. Sometimes they lost. Captain Dick Becker, the second confirmed Sabre ace of the war, said it plainly. There was no 14-to-1 kill ratio when he was flying. The Russians they fought were good. In that first year, the two sides fought to a draw. The first year, in Soviet sources, is called the Year of the Honcho. The word came from American pilot slang, borrowed from the Japanese honcho, meaning squad leader. Between April 1951 and January 1952, the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps was led by the elite 303rd and 324th Fighter Aviation Divisions, the latter under the command of Ivan Kozhedub, the highest scoring Allied pilot of World War II with 62 victories. Stalin had personally forbidden Kozhedub to fly combat missions, but the divisions he commanded were stacked with veterans who had fought the Luftwaffe. During that period, by Soviet records cross-checked against American loss reports, the MiG force shot down or damaged beyond repair 142 United Nations aircraft against 68 MiG losses. That is roughly 2-to-1 in the Soviets' favor. The top Soviet ace of the war, Major Nikolai Sutyagin, finished with 22 credited victories, including 15 F-86. About 13 of those have been confirmed against United States loss records. The man widely regarded by Western historians as the actual top scorer, Colonel Yevgeny Pepelyayev, commander of the 196th Fighter Aviation Regiment, was credited with 19 kills in Soviet records. probably 14 or 15 are real. Pepeliaev was not a product of Korea. He had learned to fly before the Germans invaded, survived the catastrophic early years on the Eastern Front when Soviet aviation was being destroyed wholesale, and come out the other side as the kind of pilot the Red Air Force built its post-war doctrine around. Aggressive, technically precise, and entirely without illusions about what air combat cost. By the time he arrived in Manchuria, he had been fighting, in one form or another, for a decade. He shot down Captain Bill Garrett on October 6, 1951, the same engagement that produced the Sabre wreckage Matskevich later analyzed. The Americans had their own measure of that standard. Captain Frederick Boots Blessa arrived in Korea in 1952 with a World War II record and a mind that treated aerial combat as a problem to be solved systematically. He would finish the war with 10 confirmed kills and produce a tactical manual. No guts, no glory, that the United States Air Force would distribute to every fighter pilot it trained for the next decade. Blesse understood better than almost anyone flying a Sabre that the MiG-15 was not an inferior aircraft. It climbed faster, turned tighter at altitude, and hit harder. Beating it required getting inside its limitations before it got inside yours. These were not amateurs. They were men who knew exactly what the MiG-15 could do, and, on the American side, exactly what it could not. What changed in late January and February of 1952 was the rotation system. The Soviets operated a personnel policy that, in retrospect, looks like an institutional act of self-sabotage. They rotated entire fighter divisions in and out of the theater, typically every 6 to 12 months. When a division had built up combat experience, it went home. The replacement division arrived as a cohesive but green unit with no embedded mentors who had fought a Sabre and lived. In February 1952, the 303rd and 324th Divisions were rotated out and replaced by units whose pilots had on average between 50 and 60 hours of total flight time on the MiG-15 before deployment. The collapse was immediate. Between February and July of 1952, Soviet records show that the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps lost 81 MiGs and 34 pilots killed by Sabres, while claiming 68 United Nations aircraft, including 36 F-86. On July 4, 1952, in a single day, 11 Soviet MiGs were shot down by Sabres for one Soviet pilot killed. 11 to 1 in a single day, with the same airframe. The aircraft had not changed. The Sabre had not been upgraded overnight. The radar gun sight, the G-suit, the hydraulic controls, the bubble canopy, all of that had been in place during the year of the Honcho, when the score was even or worse. What changed was the man inside the cockpit and the institution standing behind him. The American pilot during that summer of 1952 had spent something close to 400 hours on the F-86 before he was allowed near combat. He had trained at the aircraft gunnery school at Nellis Air Force Base outside Las Vegas, founded in 1949 specifically to teach jet-age fighter combat at a graduate level. The standing joke at Nellis was that if you ever saw the flag at full staff, you should take a picture, because someone was always being killed. Frederick Blesse, who would arrive in Korea in 1952 with 9 MiG-15s and 1 Le-9 in his future, contrasted his preparation with the World War II pilots of 1942, who had gone into combat over Europe with under 100 hours of total flight time. The Soviet rookie of 1952 had between 50 and 60 hours. That is the gap. That is everything. The Soviet system was built on lessons that came out of the Second World War, but a different Second World War than the one the Americans had fought. The Soviets had spent that war on the defensive over their own territory, with a vast investment in ground-based radar and air defense infrastructure. Their fighter doctrine reflected it. Pilots were instruments of a centralized ground-controlled intercept system that detected, tracked, identified, and vectored them onto specific targets. The pilot's job was to be a guided projectile. He flew in tight, parade-style formations of 6 aircraft in 3 pairs, stacked at staggered altitudes, controlled minute by minute from the ground. The Soviet ground control over the Yalu was excellent. By May of 1952, the 64th Air Defense Corps had built a complete radar network across the border region of Manchuria. What the system was not designed to do was let the pilot think for himself. Soviet wingmen in particular had almost no operational discretion. The leader fought, the wingman followed. The GCI net, which is the ground controllers on the radar, talking pilots onto their targets from below, left little to individual judgment. When the GCI net worked perfectly, the system was deadly. When it did not, the pilot had no doctrine to fall back on. And the GCI net could not work perfectly, because the Russians were operating under a set of self-imposed restrictions that crippled them in ways no enemy could have inflicted. Stalin had originally promised Mao Zedong that Soviet aviation would handle the air war over Korea. By October of 1950, fearful of a nuclear response from the Americans, he reneged on the promise but agreed to provide MiG-15s in limited covert air cover. The fiction of Soviet non-belligerence had to be maintained. Pilots flew in Chinese or North Korean markings, wore Chinese uniforms, carried forged Chinese identity papers, and were forbidden to fly south of a defined line. They could not fly over open water. They could not pursue a damaged United Nations aircraft toward the front. They could not chase a Sabre out to sea. One Soviet pilot who bailed out into United Nations held territory shot himself rather than be captured. Another, who came down in the Yellow Sea, was strafed by his own side to prevent the Americans from picking him up alive. The fear was not theoretical, it was operational. A Sabre in trouble could egress south or feet wet over the Yellow Sea and be safe. The MiGs could not follow. The American doctrine was almost the inverse of the Soviet one. The United States Army Air Forces had spent the early years of the Second World War getting hammered. Over Europe, against the Luftwaffe, the early bomber escort formations had been a slaughter. In the Pacific, the early Wildcats had been routinely outclimbed and outmaneuvered by the Zero. American fighter doctrine in 1942 and 1943 was rebuilt from those losses, and the rebuild produced 2 ideas that survived intact into Korea. The first was the Finger 4 formation. Originally a Luftwaffe innovation perfected by Werner Mulders in the Spanish Civil War, then adopted by the Royal Air Force, then by the Americans, the Finger 4 broke a flight of 4 aircraft into 2 pairs of leader and wingman, spaced widely enough that all 4 pilots could devote most of their attention to scanning the sky, rather than to keeping formation. Whoever spotted a threat first could become the temporary leader of his element. In Korea, Gabi Gabreski had developed an even looser variant called the Fluid 4, designed for jet speeds, in which the pairs could weave and switch leadership on the move. It became standard in the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing within weeks of his arrival. The second idea, more radical in implementation than in concept, was that the wingman was a thinking partner. He was empowered to call brakes, to spot threats, to take his own shots when the geometry presented them, to shout at his leader to disengage. He was not a tail-end Charlie blindly trailing the lead aircraft. This sounds obvious. It is not obvious. It was a hard-won doctrinal commitment that had cost American lives in 1942 to develop, and the Soviet system, for all its excellence in ground control, never produced anything quite like it. Layered on top of the doctrine was a cadre of squadron leaders who had personally fought through the bloodiest education in air combat history. When Gabreski took the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing to Suwon in November of 1951, he brought with him alumni of the 56th Fighter Group, men who had flown P-47s over Germany. The 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing under Colonel John C. Meyer carried its own roster of European theater veterans: Vermont Garrison, Harrison Thing, William Wisner, Bud Mahurin, James Hagerstrom. 6 of the men who flew Sabres in Korea finished their careers as aces in 2 wars. In 1955, Frederick Blesse took everything he had learned in Korea and wrote it down. The manual was called No Guts, No Glory. It became the foundational fighter tactics text of the United States Air Force, the Royal Air Force, the Marines, and the Republic of China Air Force for the next 2 decades. The advice it contained about fighting the MiG-15 was specific and ruthless. Force him into a horizontal fight at medium altitude. Outroll him, out-dive him. If you are in trouble, descend in a tight 6G turn, because the MiG cannot match you in sustained G without a pilot G-suit. There was one more figure in this story whose contribution did not show up in the kill columns of 1953, but who would shape every Western fighter built afterward. Captain John Boyd flew an abbreviated tour in Korea in 1953. 22 missions, all as a wingman, no air-to-air kills, no shots fired. What he did instead was watch. He watched what the Sabre could do that the MiG could not. He watched how the bubble canopy, the hydraulic controls, and the rapid maneuver transitions allowed a Sabre pilot to run a faster decision cycle than his opponent. After Korea, Boyd became head of the academic section at the Fighter Weapons School at Nellis, and in the early 1960s, working with the civilian mathematician Thomas Christie at Eglin Air Force Base, developed energy maneuverability theory. It was the foundation on which the F-15 Eagle and the F-16 Fighting Falcon were designed. The OODA loop, Boyd's later formulation of Observe, Orient, Decide Act, was the conceptual distillation of what he had seen over the Yalu, the proposition that the Sabre let the pilot run a faster decision cycle than the MiG could. The Sabre was, in 1,000 small ways, an aircraft that let a pilot think and act faster than his enemy could. And behind that aircraft stood an institution that selected for, trained for, and rewarded exactly that quality of thinking. By the end of the war, the Soviet 64th Fighter Aviation Corps had flown some 64,000 combat sorties, claimed 1,106 United Nations aircraft destroyed, and lost 335 MiGs and 120 pilots. The Americans claimed 792 MiGs for 78 Sabres. Adding the Chinese and North Korean records, the synthesis number that emerges is roughly 1,300 United Nations aircraft destroyed against 566 MiGs lost. Both sides overclaimed, both sides always do. What both sets of records agree on, when set side by side, is the pattern. When the Sabres met the elite Soviet divisions during the year of the Honcho, the score was roughly even, sometimes worse. When they met the green replacements who came after, the ratio collapsed to something between 6 and 9 to 1. When they met the Chinese and North Korean pilots, the slaughter was almost total. The aircraft was a constant. The pilot was the variable. There is an artifact that sits today in the United States National Museum of the Air Force at Wright-Patterson, recovered from a North Korean airfield where Lieutenant No Kum-sok defected to the south in September of 1953, flying his MiG-15 bis straight into Kimpo. The Americans took it apart, flew it, and evaluated it. Their conclusion, confirmed by the Sabre pilot Chuck Yeager, who test flew the captured machine, was that the MiG-15 was an outstanding aircraft, in some respects superior to the F-86, that lost the war it fought because of who was flying it. The Soviets, separately, performed the same exercise from the opposite direction. They recovered the Sabres. They reverse-engineered the radar gun sight, the all-flying tail, the hydraulic boost system, and the G-suit. They incorporated the lessons in the MiG-17 and the MiG-19. As technology, the Sabre was decoded entirely. What the Soviet system could not decode, because it was not the kind of thing a system like that could decode, was the American way of fighting. A young United States Air Force lieutenant flying his 50th combat mission as the wingman of a 28 victory European theater veteran in a fluid 4 formation, scanning through a bubble canopy, locked up by a radar gun sight he had practiced with for hundreds of hours at Nellis, wearing a G-suit, empowered by doctrine to call the break for his leader and to take his own shot when the geometry gave it to him, was the cumulative product of a decade of American institutional learning. He was not an instrument of ground control, he was a thinking participant. The Soviet system, designed for the centralized air defense of the motherland against bomber streams, never produced anything quite like him. Not because Soviet pilots lacked individual skill or courage. Sutyagin, Pepelyaev, Shchukin, Kramarenko, and Fedorets all had it in measurable quantities, but the institution did not let those men become what their American counterparts became. It rotated them home before their lessons could be absorbed. It put them under the thumb of ground control. It forbade them from chasing a damaged Sabre out over the water. When the United States Navy reviewed its own performance in the early years of Vietnam, where its carrier-based fighters had inherited the Korean kill ratio infrastructure, but had quietly let the gunnery school it ran disband in 1960, the Alt report concluded that the Navy's air-to-air ratio had collapsed from 12 to 1 in Korea to 2.5 to 1 over North Vietnam. The response, in March of 1969, was the Navy Fighter Weapons School at NAS Miramar, known by its informal name, Top Gun. The lesson the Navy was relearning was the lesson Korea had taught the Air Force a decade earlier. In two near-equal fighters, you do not win with the airframe. You win with the human. Today, an F-86 Sabre sits in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, polished, with the small radar dome of the AN/APG-30 still visible in the upper lip of its nose. The placard tells you what its top speed was, what its armament was, and when it served. It does not tell you that the man it was designed for had to be built by a system that had spent 10 years figuring out how to build him. That was the thing the Soviets never figured out. The aircraft was not a secret. The pilot was. And the pilot was a product of an institution that had learned, in the hardest possible way, that giving a thinking man a good airplane and getting out of his way was worth more than any radar, any cannon, or any ceiling. The Soviets had a better climbing fighter and a heavier gun. The Americans had a better way of fighting. Over MiG Alley between 1950 and 1953, the second one won.